part of the reason it's a big day is because the FCC is auctioning off spectrum for 5G. It could affect many of our cell phone service as well as other communications. To take us through this day and what's going on with the spectrum for 5G, welcome now Ajit Pai. He's partner in Searchlight Capital. Mr. Pai, of course, served as FCC chair in the Trump administration, and before that was a member of the FCC. So thank you so much, Ajit, for being with us. For those of us who don't follow this closely, how much spectrum do we need for 5G, and how much has already been allocated?
Well, thanks for having me on, David. I really appreciate you taking the time. The FCC has allocated a lot of spectrum. In fact, when I led the commission, we held the most spectrum auctions and auctioned more spectrum during those 4 years when I led the commission than had been held by all mobile broadband providers in the United States combined when I took office. So we've already injected a huge amount of supply, but what's critical is to keep that pipeline going. And that's why today is so significant. The very last auction that I structured, the auction is starting today, and that's a prime piece of property, so to speak, because it occupies a part of the electromagnetic spectrum that allows you to carry a lot of data and to carry it a lot further than other typical spectrum bands could. So it's a watershed day for the FCC, for the wireless innovators out there, and for consumers at the end of the day.
And is it also a watershed day potentially for people living in rural areas? Because I think I've seen some indication that some of this spectrum is really going to help people in rural areas who don't have the service now.
That's absolutely right. In fact, one of the reasons why I early on targeted this particular band for an auction is that 96% of the spectrum was essentially unused west of the Mississippi. That includes a lot of very rural areas that desperately need wireless access. And there have been some isolated examples of rural communities using it. And so we thought, well, if we auction it and require the companies that win to use it, rural consumers, too, can benefit from this wireless revolution that's overtaking the world. So my hope is that once this auction is started and completed, and once these networks start to get built out in all these parts of the country, we'll start to see rural consumers benefiting from some of those wireless applications that could have particular punch in those rural areas, things like precision agriculture or telehealth. These are glimpses of the future that we're seeing now. And this mid-band spectrum auction could help make it become a reality.
So let me ask you about competition. And if I can break it down into two pieces. One is competition among people within the United States, providers in the United States, and then we'll turn to competition of the United States against the rest of the world. Among people within the United States, there is some concern about concentration among wireless carriers. Is there a chance that this spectrum auction actually could reinforce that because of the big players, people who are already big, can bid more and actually press out some of the smaller players?
I don't believe so for a few different reasons. Number one, the spectrum auctions that have already been held over the past couple of years, including when I led the FCC, have involved a very wide variety of players, and not just wireless operators, by the way, but some enterprises that want to be able to have spectrum themselves have been bidding at spectrum auctions. Secondly, what we're seeing is that new entrants at scale are really making a mark in the marketplace. For example, cable companies have been leveraging virtual network operations relationships with some of the big wireless carriers, and so they are offering services themselves and taking hundreds of thousands of subscribers of share. Finally, the other thing I would point out was 5G in particular is unique. It's very decentralized, and so the future of 5G, I think, is going to be to allow anybody, an enterprise operator, for example, to set up their own private wireless network without any necessity for going to some of the bigger players, and then you can construct the network or manage it as you see fit. And so that decentralized wireless network of the future is going to become the paradigm a lot faster if we get it right on 5G.
As you know well, there's a lot of concern about increasing concentration in general in a lot of U.S. industry. Are you suggesting maybe that's not really a problem with wireless? Because as we look at it, there's just really 3 or 4 players in the entire country. But are you saying that really that doesn't reflect the true competitive nature of the marketplace?
Well, I think if you look at the prices over time, in real terms, prices have gone down for consumers, number one. Number two, as I said, the 5G networks of the future are going to be much more decentralized. And so that's part of the reason why I'm confident that we're going to see a lot more competition, a lot more consumer choice in terms of services. The other piece of it, I do think that there are some areas within the wireless industry that are consolidated. So, for example, when you're talking about infrastructure, traditionally there have only been a few players, typically foreign players like Huawei Huawei, Ericsson, and Nokia. But one of the reasons when I was at the FCC, I pushed what you might call the softwareization of wireless infrastructure, is that that's something that became very, very decentralized and competitive very quickly. And now that new technology called Open Radio Access Network technology is becoming a reality. And full disclosure, I work with a couple of companies that are doing work on this front, but I believe in it to my core because that's one of the ways to promote more competition. Antitrust is a very blunt instrument tool, as you know, and it's always retrospective and slow moving. But if you can innovate your way out of a problem to promote more competition, that's a far better way to proceed, I think.
So you said the magic word, Huawei, because I wanted to turn to U.S. competition against the rest of the world, particularly China, that has been the subject of some controversy here. How are we doing when it comes to 5G? I had the sense we were behind, not just in spectrum, but also in some of the hardware.
Well, I think in terms of spectrum assets, we are far better positioned today than we were when I took office in 2017. At that time, we didn't have a lot of spectrum auctions in the pipeline. We were falling behind in terms of a comprehensive plan to attack the problem. And the different U.S. government agencies were still trying to hold on to their turf in terms of spectrum assets. So typically when the FCC auctions spectrum, it has to work with some of those government agencies. And so we did some of the heavy lifting on spectrum to enable us to push a lot of that spectrum into the commercial marketplace. On infrastructure, too, we made a lot of progress, streamlined the rules to promote more densification of these wireless networks and more fiber deployment, which is critical for carrying that wireless traffic. And I think one of the things that we also did was to work in an unprecedented way with some of our partners around the world to help them understand the security dimension of 5G. And once I think now it's become clear, but at the time it wasn't necessarily, that the only problem with Huawei and ZTE gear, aside from the security issues, was that it was very cheap, but it came at a cost. And those long-term contracts they were locking you into might ultimately not be good for wireless operators. So, I think we are very well positioned today vis-a-vis China, but that's not to say that there's more work to be done on things like semiconductors, for example, or making sure that more allies understand that risk-based framework we need to have for cybersecurity. This is going to be a long-term effort. It's not a short-term effort, and it's going to require an all-of-government and a private sector stakeholder approach as well.
Just what I want to ask about is semiconductors. We now have a CHIPS Act that it looks like the president is going to sign fairly soon here. Will that be a step in the right direction for the United States in terms of competition around the world, and how big a step?
I think it's an important step forward, as you heard from the Intel CEO in the last hour. One of the issues that we've had in the United States is that we do tend to be a global leader in terms of the design of chips. But in terms of manufacture, we've always been reliant on what are called fabs that lie outside of America's borders. And to the extent that the U.S. government is supporting the manufacture of those chips here in the United States, that could help us insulate from some of the security risks we've seen, and also potentially drive more of the innovative companies we have here in the United States to grow. We certainly want the new companies that are upstarts in this area, especially those that are fusing, say, 5G and AI and some of these other newer technologies, to have the ability to design and manufacture here at home.